Aloha! Welcome back to Hawaii News Now's extended stream. I'm Emily Cristobal, and today we have a new episode of the Repairing Earth podcast, where we take an exclusive look at an expedition deep down into the Pacific. That's where NOAA scientists are doing crucial work and making groundbreaking discoveries, even finding an animal they thought had been extinct since pre-dinosaur times. Now, here is the 19th episode of the Repairing Earth podcast. Aloha, welcome back to Repairing Earth. I'm your host, Emily Cristobal, and today we are diving into the Pacific Ocean, where scientists are studying areas deep underwater that have never before been explored. To learn more about this, we are joined by Brian Kennedy. He is one of the lead scientists in this project made possible through NOAA's Ocean Exploration Cooperative Institute. He and the team use special equipment and technology to survey areas around the Pacific Remote Islands Marine National Monument, located southwest of the Hawaiian Islands. Thank you so much for joining us. So, Brian, I'm sure this was a very unique and eye-opening experience. Can you explain to us what exactly was the purpose of this expedition?
The expedition we just got back from down to the waters around Palmyra and Kingman Reef was really baseline characterization, true exploration, going places where we've never been before and seeing what the life and the geology is there like. Really very similar to kind of what Lewis and Clark did in the 1800s after the Louisiana Purchase, is going to the unknown parts of America and seeing what's there and making a map.
As a lead scientist, what exactly was your role in this program, and what objectives did you have?
So I was the co-science lead for biology, and so my job was to help pick the individual dive sites, work with the team of other scientists on the ship, collecting and processing samples, making sure they're archived, and then really, sitting in the control room on the vessel and running a watch, and going to these seamounts that I've never seen before, and documenting what's there. And so I was running an entire watch. We had a data logger, a science communication fellow, another scientist. I had a geologist in the control room with me to help me understand and contextualize what we were seeing in the seafloor in terms of the rocks and how that might affect the biology that I was most interested in. And then we had a whole team of engineers, from video engineers to ROV pilots and navigators, controlling the remotely operated submersible that allows us to get all this really cool video of the seafloor.
Very cool. And you mentioned biological aspects that you were interested in looking into. What were your main interests in this expedition?
On two fronts, kind of broadly, is just seeing what's there. This area has been so underexplored. There was a previous, I think, two deep submergence dives or ROV dives in the area inside U.S. waters, but outside the current boundaries of the Pacific Rhode Island Marine National Monument. And so this whole giant swath, hundreds of thousands of square kilometers, we really don't have a clue what was living down there. And so first and foremost was going out there and really just seeing what's there, identifying the types of corals, seeing where they are. And that's the most important thing on an exploration mission like this. My personal research interest is I'm really interested in the effects of the different shapes of the seamounts and the location of the seamounts and how that controls what type of corals we see living on them. So I kind of had the double fold of objective of getting out there and just doing that baseline characterization and seeing what's there for the first time, and then building data sets that'll help ecologists later on better understand why things live where they live in the deep sea or in this part of the Central Pacific.
That's super interesting. And, I was wondering if you could describe to our viewers, what exactly does this underwater terrain look like?
A lot of it's very rocky with some sediment draped across the seafloor. All of these seamounts are volcanic in origin. And so these are basalts, pillow basalts, things like that you would see in shallow water and on some of the Hawaiian Islands. You see different lava formations. We can also see submerged carbonate, which is remnants of when these features were in shallow water. They had reefs, just like the Hawaiian Islands and the Line Islands where you see now. And so where you find bare rock is what's really important for my kind of work, because that's where the coral can grow, is it needs a bare rock to be able to attach to and then grow. And so a lot of the area you see in the deep sea is this sediment draped, very thinly draped sediment over the rock, with these big, beautiful ancient corals growing on some boulders. And so one of my favorite moments on this expedition is we were coming up the side of this one seamount about 1,000 meters underwater, and we hadn't been seeing a lot of coral yet. We'd been a few interspersed here and there, and some fish. And then we come up on this one boulder, and suddenly there was just this explosion of life, multiple colors, big red corals and white corals and some yellow corals, all pretty tightly packed. And 2-3 meters, you're like 6 to 9 feet tall. These things are many hundreds, if not thousands of years old. And you just get this explosion of life on this one particular summit of this seamount. And that's one of the things that fascinates me as a scientist, is why that one summit had such an explosion of life, whereas the rest of the sides of this feature had a lot thinner, were a lot thinner in terms of the number of corals we were seeing. And so those kind of moments are really special for me when you see these high density and high diversity communities. This one specific instance was actually the first high density coral community documented in deep water outside the monument, but in US waters around Palmyra. And so it was a really nifty discovery to see a community like this in an area they've never been documented before.
That's super awesome. I can only imagine what that looks like. And you mentioned you were seeing coral super abundant in some areas and others not so much. I know you're still doing research and I'm sure you're looking through that data that you collected, but do you have any hypotheses as to why that is?
I think primarily it's going to be very much a result of current and how the current flows over these areas. And so as we think about, good management of these areas, current can blow sediments and very small particulate matter in the water very long distances. And so understanding the flow in the seafloor and how that affects coral is really important for the biology alone, but it's also really important as we think about other uses for the deep sea and shallow water, ocean uses that can affect the deep sea, and how these currents can blow sediments and pollutants potentially around. So as we think about deep sea mining or in these areas, the plumes of sediment that's going to be kicked up by those kind of activities can go really long distances and probably can have really dramatic effects on the communities of organisms we find down here. And so that's another outgrowth of the work we're doing here, is by understanding the distribution and the density in which we find these organisms and helping to understand what controls that. It'll help us make better decisions about where to protect things and where we can safely utilize some deep sea ecosystems or not, depending on kind of what the policy ends up being.
Absolutely. And in this area, you can find some of the most pristine water in the world. What other threats does this area face?
Yeah, so there's a real host of threats. Number one being just climate change. Even in the deep sea, miles underwater, there are the effects of climate change. It's getting warmer. It's getting more acidic. We're seeing those impacts start showing up in the deep sea. There's derelict fishing gear and there's litter out there. We're finding microplastics still in the deep sea. There's deep sea mining potentials. This area in particular is right in the area, or right next to the area. The exact boundaries are kind of still gray, of something called the prime crust zone. So this is an area where the ferromanganese crust on the sides of the seafloor are thick enough and have potentially commercially valuable minerals and stuff that in high enough concentrations they could be economically viable to extract. And so this area right around Palmyra and Kingman is particularly interesting because it's right on kind of this eastern edge of the prime crust zone, where we could see commercial crust extraction occurring at some point in the future.
Yeah, I'm curious about that crust zone. You mentioned minerals. What types of minerals are found in this area?
A whole host of different kind of what we call rare earth elements. There's manganese, there's cobalt, are kind of some of the biggest ones. There's a whole bunch that I'm really bad at pronouncing as well, because you've probably never heard of way down on the periodic table, but that are really important for some of the high tech and really green infrastructure stuff, batteries, high temperature power generators like are used in wind turbines and stuff all need small amounts of these minerals, but when you start thinking about scaling up to industrial scale processes, it really turns into a lot of tonnage of these minerals, and they're found in a lot of these deep sea crust and manganese nodules that you can find in this area.
I see. And even bringing up the impacts of climate change, you said that you're seeing these effects deep down in this underwater area. And you're even seeing microplastics. And it's really wild to comprehend that all these actions that we have up here on land are already affecting these areas and Earth at different levels. I wanted to go back to, that topic of climate change. Can you go more into detail of what those impacts are in the deep sea?
Sure. So we're really still figuring that out, honestly. We know so little about the deep sea that we're in that baseline characterization. We're just going out there for the first time and documenting what it is. And in order to assess change, you need a time series, basically. So we're really only at the infancy of understanding the impacts of climate change in the deep sea, because frankly, we just don't have the data, the length of data down there. But temperature being one of the most dramatic. When you start seeing temperature coming up, these organisms down there live in very cold environments, and as you start warming them up, that can have a really dramatic effect on their physiology. In areas where ocean acidification is also beginning to be a problem, and so some of these deep sea corals lay down aragonite skeletons, just like shallow water corals, but it's generally more acidic in deeper water in this part of the world. And so they are right on the maximum kind of acidity level pH of the ocean that they can still make a skeleton. And if the water gets more acidic, it's going to have an even bigger effect on some of these genera of corals in the deep sea than it does in shallow water, because they grow so close to their pH tolerance level already.
Yeah, and this is kind of a tough question, but as we are trying to combat climate change, I was wondering if you could give any insight of what you think can be done, needs to be done to fight this crisis and make sure that, the things that we are seeing right now to deter those effects of climate change.
So I don't think there's any one size fits all solution. We kind of need a little bit of everything. And that ranges from using less fossil fuels to being better about, capturing some of these emissions probably in some way, shape, or form. We're getting to that point where just stopping producing more isn't really going to stop climate change in the level we need it to. So we're probably going to have to start thinking about large-scale carbon sequestration activities or something like that. This isn't my area of expertise per se. It's really going to have to end up being all solutions on deck being used in order, because the problem is so big, and we've been at this for 150, 200 years now. We've been burning, oil at an industrial scale. And if we're going to limit the warming to the 1.5 or even 2 degrees Celsius kind of limits that a lot of people think is the best case scenario, we're going to have to take really dramatic action. And that's going to involve a little bit of everything from using less to using more wisely, and probably even recapturing some of the carbon we've emitted.
Yeah, thank you so much for providing your insight on that. And you mentioned organisms. What kinds of life are you seeing down in this deep sea area?
So there's a whole host of things, a lot of things that you would see just diving on the reefs of Hawaii. You can see their cousins. And then you can see some things down there that you really can't see anywhere else in the world. So one of my favorite organisms is the stalked crinoids. So in shallow water, you see unstalked crinoids, relatively common. These are feather stars, or a type of echinoderm. And you can definitely see them on the reefs around Hawaii. But in the deep sea, they have a cousin called a stalked crinoid that are these big, beautiful, flower-looking animals. But they grow on this long stalk instead up, and they look like, called sea lilies, and that's really what they look like a lot of times. And these were thought extinct in the fossil record. They're prevalent in the fossil record from hundreds of millions of years ago. Up until we started exploring the deep ocean, we thought these were a relic of pre-dinosaur times, and now we find that they're one of the most common organisms in the deep sea. And so these are some of my favorite things to see down there. We see all kinds of different types of corals, some like some of the black corals and some of the sclerotinian corals that are pretty similar to what you'd see in shallow water. And then you see a lot of octocorals in the deep sea kind of dominate. And these are your fan corals and stuff like that, cousins of those you see in the deep sea. There's a whole range of different deep sea fish, from big, 6-gill sharks that grow to be, 15 plus feet, to little dog sharks and things like that. And then some of your shallow water kind of more familiar species like hammerheads we can see and pretty far down too. So it's a whole host, and it's really of different life, and it's really kind of a unique ecosystem, a cool blend of things that humans aren't used to seeing at all, along with some kind of more familiar looking things you would see around the reefs when you're scuba diving in shallower depths.
Wow, that's so fascinating. And I wanted to go into the route that you took to get there. Your start and end point was Hawaii, but can you describe where exactly this area is in relation to the Hawaiian Islands?
Yeah, so we left from the UH Marine Center just down in Honolulu Harbor, and it took us about 3.5 days to cover the 1,000 miles down to get to the northern ends of U.S. waters again, north of Kingman and Palmyra. And so that was a pretty straight shot. We had nice trade winds on the way down. It was a little bouncy, but wasn't too bad. The people who'd never sailed before were fighting a little bit to get their sea legs as we were sailing through the trades. And then once we got down there, we didn't see land once the entire 29 days we were at sea. We stayed over the horizon the whole time. And we had really pretty good weather. We got weathered out 1 or 2 days. But for the most part, kind of the daily life on the ship is we try and put the RV in the water sometime in the morning, and then spend between 12 and 24 hours with the RV on the seafloor. And then we recover it, and then we'll move over to another seamount, generally map along the way and make some preparatory maps of the area, and then kind of rinse and repeat. So we ended up getting 16 dives in across the 4 weeks of the expedition. And yeah, and then on the transit back, the trades laid down a little bit, and so we had a nice smooth ride back to Oahu.
And speaking of technology, you mentioned the RV. Can you describe to us what it looks like and how exactly it works?
We were working with a two-body ROV system, so it's actually two different robots that work together. They're attached to each other, but they're kind of controlled independently. One is Hercules, and that's kind of the primary vehicle we use for the biology. It gets down close to the seafloor, and this is a robot about the size of a mid-size sport utility vehicle, SUV. It's 6 or 7 thousand pounds, about almost 10 feet tall. And it's just arrayed with lights and sensors, and it's got two robotic arms that allow us to pick up samples and stuff like that. It's got a whole host of different water tanks and baskets for us to bring samples back. We can collect water samples. We've got a suction unit, basically like an underwater vacuum cleaner, that allows us to suck up sediment or potentially small floating organisms. And all of this is remote controlled from the ship. All the signals are passed down via fiber optic cables down to the ROV, along with about 3,000 volts of electricity to power the propellers and everything on it. And the second vehicle we were using is a vehicle called Atalanta, and it's what we call a camera sled, and it hovers higher up in the water and kind of is a protective overwatch. It watches what Hercules is doing, gives us a kind of an eye in the sky. It's like having a personal drone following Hercules around, so we can see for safety reasons what's working around the vehicle, but also help scientists like me contextualize what we're seeing. Hercules can be zoomed in specifically on one or two corals, kind of getting a really microscopic almost view of what's going on in the small, and the Atalanta view gives us kind of a bigger, wider area of where is this boulder in relation to other boulders, how far does the coral community go. And so it's a really nice kind of mesoscale view of what the area is like, that gives some context to what we're seeing in the zoomed in, looking at one or two individual corals from Hercules.
Yeah, and I know a lot of the work that you're doing is focused in the Pacific remote islands, but I was wondering if the research that you're doing can translate to other surrounding island communities.
Yeah, certainly. So we were at the very north west tip of the Line Islands, and so we're seeing kind of the geological future of what Christmas and some of the other kind of currently islands that will eventually submerge over geological time scale. I mean, we're still talking about millions of years, but it helps us understand the progression of how these island chains kind of grow and grow, form, and then sink. And so looking further down the hotspot chain helps us understand kind of the geological future of some of the current islands in the Line Islands. And then understanding the patterns of biodiversity, why things live where they live across the Pacific is super helpful when managing them to kind of understand gene flow. And if you affect one thing in one area, are those animals endemic to there and aren't going to be able to be resupplied from elsewhere? So one of the things I'm really interested in is looking at the Phoenix Islands, which is the next big island chain to the west, and how related or dissimilar the Line Islands deep sea communities are from the Phoenix Islands, and then from the Gilbert Islands, which is the next island chain even further west, which kind of makes up the central, specific island groups. We don't really understand how well connected those are. And so if you affect the life in one island chain, how much will that affect the animals that are leaving as far away as 1,000 miles away? But if you cut off larval supplies and things like that, there may be a lot of communication in between these island chains that we really don't know about yet. And so, everything in the ocean is connected. It's all one giant ocean. But within that, there is still a lot of segmentation, smaller groupings, areas where you see different life. It's not a monolith. And so it's a really interesting study system because there are, to our eyes, basically invisible barriers in which these organisms can and can't transit, but they can also, at the same, or the flip side of that coin, is they can also transit as larvae thousands of miles. And so one island chain really can affect another island chain in terms of these deep sea communities.
That's super interesting. And, just as a normal person who doesn't have the scientific background trying to understand all this, it kind of sounds like how up here on land, how different regions could have different temperatures, different climates. For example, a tropical or warmer climate versus, a colder or wintry climate in other areas. The ocean is kind of similar to that, in which that depending on where you are in the Pacific Ocean, it could have different aspects. So that's super cool to kind of think about that.
That's an excellent analogy.
And finally, what comes next after this expedition?
So next step is first for my type of research is annotating all the video. So sitting down, we had over 200 hours of bottom time with the vehicle. And so a group of people are going to have to sit down and watch all of that video and take really, really careful notes. We take quick notes on the ship, but we're too busy kind of trying to look and go and to make the operational decisions of what we're going to do next to take a really detailed look at every individual organism, estimate its size, really go through all the reference material, figure out exactly what we've seen, go through the samples we collected. So it'll take probably a couple years to get through and annotate all the video. And so we'll have a really good understanding of every single organism we imaged and documented and where it is. And then we'll couple that with some of the automatic sensor data that we had to get the temperature, the salinity, the dissolved oxygen, things like that, and merge all those data sets where we can start asking the scientific questions of why does coral X live where it does? And then other people, not me, because this isn't really my field of expertise, will start looking at the genetics of, our corals that we found here in Palmyra related to the corals we saw 2 years ago when I was working around Howland and Baker, and how closely related the gene flow is between those different island chains and stuff like that. So from the hard science standpoint of it, we've got several years of analysis and projects and stuff in order to really make heads or tails of the literally tens of terabytes of data we brought back, plus hundreds and hundreds of physical specimens that need to be worked up and looked under at the microscopes. From the more policy standpoint, this area is particularly interesting because it is under consideration as a proposed national marine sanctuary. And so the first public comment on that just closed while we were actually underway on the vessel. But there'll be some very interesting policy decisions coming out of Washington and about how to manage and best manage this area of the ocean. And so that's going to be happening on a little bit of a shorter timeline, probably in the next few years. And so, science is slow and policy sometimes is fast. And so there's always the dealing with the disconnect in those two timelines. And so we have to kind of juggle both the scientific timeline of how long it takes to actually process these samples, but also collecting enough data and having it ready enough to be used in an informed fashion for good policymaking, potentially on a tighter timeline.
Absolutely. And the work continues to keep protecting this area and see any changes that may come up in the years and years to come. Thank you so much for joining me in on this conversation. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for your interest in reporting. Like the science is only as good as if people know about the science and know about what we found. So we really appreciate your interest in the story.
For more stories like these, or for more episodes of Repairing Earth, head to hawaiinewsnow.com or listen wherever you get your podcasts. This is your host, Emily Cristobal, and mahalo for listening.